Good afternoon and welcome to a special discussion on the topic COVID-19 treatments before vaccine. Today's event is presented by Syngene Pharmaceuticals, AdvanceDx Biological Laboratories, Red Crow, and Startup Health. My name is Logan Plaster. I'm the editor-in-chief at Startup Health and host of the podcast Health Innovation Matters, and I'm going to be your host for the next 45 minutes, maybe to an hour. I'm here to facilitate a conversation about COVID-19 treatments where we'll get under the hood and beyond the headlines about antivirals and anti-inflammatory therapies. We'll talk about combination therapies and about our immune systems. Plus, we'll take your questions at the end. There's a Q&A spot there in the middle at the bottom of your screen. So take advantage of that and we'll answer some questions later. But my primary job is to get out of the way because we've got two pharma experts joining me that you're really going to enjoy hearing from. I'll give a word about each of them and then give them a chance to introduce themselves. First, Dr. Anthony Japour is an infectious disease specialist who's received several research grants, including a National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease K11 Award and an RO1 Principal Investigator grant in the area of HIV drug resistance. Dr. Japour's work as an executive at Abbott Labs contributed to accelerated FDA approval for the HIV drug Kaletra. He recently became the CEO of AdvanceDx Biological Laboratories. Dr. Japour, great to have you on this conversation. As a way of intro, why don't you tell us briefly about what you're working on right now at AdvanceDx?
Thank you, Logan. Currently at AdvanceDx, we have a suite of COVID-19 diagnostic products in three categories. Our first product is the actual detection of the virus. The second product is looking at antibodies to see who's immune. And the third product that we have is looking at the quasi-species of various strains that might be floating around in the local communities.
Very nice, very nice. Okay, our next guest is Jackie Iversen, who's head of clinical development at Syngene Pharmaceutical. Jackie completed a research fellowship in pharmacokinetics and pain at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Jackie, great to have you as well. As an intro, maybe you could tell us a bit about your research at Sloan Kettering and how it plays into your work you're currently doing at Syngene.
Great, thank you, Logan. It's great to be with everyone today. When I was a research fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, we were probably on the cutting edge at that time of treating pain, particularly cancer pain. And through looking at the pharmacokinetics of drugs and doing research on that, I really wanted to take away from that and employ it into how a consumer could use pain medications, both in the over-the-counter and the prescription strength. We really need better and more inventive ways of how we treat pain. And the platform of agents at Syngene Pharmaceutical really is looking at not just pain, but how inflammation plays a part into pain management.
Awesome. Okay. Before we dive in, quick housekeeping. As I mentioned a second ago, there's an option to add your questions. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom, and we will save some time at the end for your questions. So don't hesitate to drop those comments in. Okay, now let's dive in. So the name of this webinar is Treatments Before Vaccines. Obviously, with Operation Warp Speed and recent news from pharmaceutical companies like Moderna, we're hearing a lot about vaccines and this rapid development process. So why is it important to bring attention to treatments right now? And why say treatments before vaccines? So we'll kind of unpack that title for me.
Sure. So vaccines are a wonderful amazing pharmaceutical product that we can offer to the large population. And vaccines are great, except vaccines take quite a bit of time to be created. Most people are very familiar with the influenza vaccine that we have different strains of every year. And very quickly, we're able to use the vaccine component from last year and just tweak the strain in order to create the yearly vaccine, the yearly influenza vaccine. However, in order to bring a brand new vaccine to the market, it's very time consuming because not only do you have to prove safety and efficacy in an animal model, but then you need to provide that same dose into humans and look also for safety and efficacy in a very large number of people. in order to, before you would want to give it to the mass population. And making these vaccines is a little bit tricky. It all depends on whether you're able to create it and your body's able to respond to this vaccine. Anthony, you have a lot of experience in infectious disease and also knowledge of vaccines. So I'm hoping that you can tell the audience about how there's certain viruses that we do have vaccines for and certain viruses we don't.
Right. So the usual timeline for the development of a vaccine is about 12 to 18 months, and that's what we're hearing is likely to be the timeline we're looking at for COVID-19. It might be shorter, but we're looking at 12 to 18 months. The vaccines that we have include, as you mentioned, the annual influenza shot, because we have to keep up with the new strains that are coming along. Also, we have a vaccine for shingles. We have vaccines for mumps, measles, rubella, tetanus. We don't have a vaccine, for example, for HIV infection yet. We also have vaccines for hepatitis A and B. So the technology is out there, but it does take time. Yeah.
You said 12 to 18 months. I know, I mean, in the past that those timelines were even much longer, but we're on this heightened timeline. So if someone's hearing that, they're thinking 12 months, 18 months, what am I going to do? What are we going to do with COVID-19 before that happens? You know, we can't, people are probably thinking, I can't live kind of the way I am living right now. What are the options that people have for the next 12 months while vaccines are being created?
Yeah. Logan, this is a great question that we're all faced with today, and not just here in the United States, but around the world, until a vaccine, a potential candidate, could be administered to everybody. The only thing we can do right now is we can avoid getting the virus, and we can also avoid spreading the virus. So when we talk about the use of masks, it's very important. We know that this virus is spread through droplets that come out of your nose and your mouth. And they get airborne when you speak or cough or talk. And these droplets can then get introduced to another person by contact on a surface, and then they might take that active virus and put it next to their face, their nose, their mouth, and then they could have an active COVID-19 virus. So it's very important, as you know, the CDC is recommending, that we wear masks and that we socially distance. You know, they're recommending 6 feet because of how transmissible this actual virus is. And each virus is different in how it can be transmitted and how you also can avoid transmission.
Dr. Japour, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, until a vaccine becomes available, our current approach is to diagnose everyone who is actively infected through, as I mentioned, the diagnostic tests. We have the nasal swab test that is already out there. We are also working on a saliva option because many people don't like the nasopharyngeal. It's very painful. As well as diagnosing, we also need to treat. We have 2 drugs that have been approved by the FDA for emergency use, that being the remdesivir by Gilead, as well as the hydroxychloroquine, which is a generic. So those are the 2 products that we're using for treatment. And then to diagnose and to find out who's already been exposed by having the antibodies to the COVID-19. And those people presumably have been exposed, they've recovered, and are no longer susceptible.
You know, Jackie, I want to get into kind of your more personal experience. You know, you work at Northwell Health in New York, one of the really COVID-19 hotspots, and you've seen this treatment that Dr. Japour was talking about in action. You know, he mentioned 2 of the treatments on the market. And I wonder if you could just walk us through, just on a very practical level, how are COVID-19 patients being treated right now?
Yes. So it's correct. I work at Northwell Health, which is a very large hospital system throughout New York, Long Island. It spreads out to Westchester and also into New Jersey. And I worked specifically at Huntington Hospital, and we had, well, our hospital was actually at full capacity with patients who were COVID positive.
Wow.
This was, and that was during the month of April. Our numbers have come down since. Typically because there is no known treatment yet that everyone feels that's safe and effective against COVID-19, that patients having symptoms would pretty much wait at home until they really felt that they needed to be hospitalized. When they would come into the hospital, they were very, very sick. We would start them, in the beginning, we were starting them on hydroxychloroquine, and we were also starting them on very high doses of steroids. So it's a combination of using not just an antiviral agent. And I just want to pause there because hydroxychloroquine really was believed to be a great agent against COVID-19 because not only did it possess an antiviral capability, but it's also a drug that was repurposed and is used for arthritis, which is an inflammatory disease.
Mm-hmm.
So using hydroxychloroquine seemed to be a great idea. And even the studies that were done in cell cultures showed that it had very good antiviral capability. After treating so many patients, some of the literature came out and it's not showing that it was really being very effective. So a lot of now our patients are being switched over to remdesivir. And as Dr. Japour mentioned, this is a drug that received emergency use authorization from the FDA to be used in patients. So again, remdesivir was tried out in against the virus in cell cultures and was found to be very effective as an antiviral. So we're hoping that we'll see some activity in the human, a human person, to determine if this is decreasing the virus at all. However, we notice with COVID-19 that there's also a very large inflammatory process that goes on. Patients are coming to the hospital and they have these, what we call inflammatory markers are very high, sometimes 5 times normal. And what happens is we believe that this inflammatory process is what is causing a lot of the end organ damage that we're seeing in very ill patients. And when I mean end organ damage, we're talking about the big organs. We're talking about the heart, we're talking about the lungs, and we're talking about the kidneys. And we believe it's not so much the virus that is causing the damage to these organs, but we believe it's the inflammatory response. And I'm so happy that Dr. Japour is with us because I wanted him to explain why do viruses cause such an inflammatory response in humans.
Right, these viruses are coming from another species. And for example, influenza usually starts out by being in a pig. And pigs are genetically closely related to humans. So even though it does cause an illness, the viral infection, the inflammatory component is not as strong as, for example, now COVID, which comes from a bat, which is a bird virus, an avian virus, which is like a reptile. So our bodies are reacting in a very extreme way against the COVID virus, unlike like an influenza or other kind of viral species that are coming from animals that are more closely related to humans. And it's really what's putting people in the hospital is the inflammatory component because the person's having such an extreme reaction to the virus, and all of those cytokines and white blood cells are going to the lung and not allowing the lung to exchange oxygen, which is what we need our lungs for. And that's why they're going on to respirators. So even though we have antiviral treatments or treatment that we feel is effective, we still don't know what the ideal anti-inflammatory drugs are that both have to be used in the treatment of this disease.
Interesting. Let's unpack that idea of that inflammatory response, that kind of severe inflammatory response. Jackie, what does that entail and why is that so damaging?
Yeah, so we notice that when patients come into our hospital that we look at their lab values, and it's extraordinary. We are seeing what we call markers of inflammation that are, as I was saying, 5 times higher than normal. These include what we call C-reactive protein, and also erythrocyte sedimentation rate, and also serum ferritin and D-dimer, and also interleukin-6 and interleukin-1 are all elevated. And all of these are markers of inflammation that we've known that increase similar to other diseases of inflammation. For example, we typically see these markers elevated with arthritis, an inflammatory response disease. We see them elevated with irritable bowel disorder. We see them elevated with diabetes. And we also see them elevated with trauma and also certain cancers. So it's very interesting that these patients are coming in and it's just all across the board, this huge inflammatory response. And it's, as Anthony's saying, it's extremely damaging to all of the other organs to have such a huge and unprevented response to this virus.
Yeah, these are the same factors that help us to get over viral illnesses. We need all of these immune markers to protect us against any kind of viral infection. But in this particular case, because the virus is causing such an extreme immunologic response, it's actually working against us. And this was the same thing that was seen in 1918 with the great influenza pandemic. That was also a bird virus. And that's when so many people died, really more from the inflammation than the actual virus itself.
Interesting. Just sort of on a side note, do you feel like there's a general public misconception about this idea of inflammation, anti-inflammatory treatments, and general misunderstandings of what causes problems with COVID-19? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that what we're hearing about in the literature is the term that's called cytokine storm. And this cytokine storm is when you have your regular immune response that's, like as Anthony was saying, is good and acceptable. And then for some reason, this virus, as viruses do this, is they send us into what's called a cytokine storm. And that's a term that you're probably going to hear a lot of.
Yeah, I've heard that mentioned a lot. It's one of those things that gets thrown around, and people generally just don't quite know how to pin it down. They don't quite know what that is. So Dr. Japour, maybe you could break down a little bit more. What is happening with that cytokine storm?
So basically, our bodies are reacting in a very severe way so that our white blood cells, our red blood cells are pouring out all of these things that should be protective, but it's spiraling down into what we call a disseminated intravascular coagulation, a DIC type of picture, with these inflammatory cytokines filling the lungs and causing a lot of fluid to be built up in the lung and not allowing the lungs to exchange oxygen. In addition, it's preventing the kidneys from working, it's causing strokes, it's causing blood clots, it's causing hepatitis. In fact, every organ is involved in this cytokine storm, leading to hospitalization, need for ventilator, in some case needing for renal dialysis, basically shutdown of all the organs. Gotcha. Once a person gets through it, and so what people have been doing, in the hospitals is trying these different anti-inflammatory agents, none of which have been proven, but are known to block, say, IL-6 or IL-2 or some of these other cytokines, really more on an experimental basis, just because we don't know what else to use.
Can you give me an example? Can you give me an example of some of those experiments that have taken place, or kind of what people are trying?
Sure. So at Northwell Health, we noticed that the IL-6 and the IL-1, and these are inflammatory markers. They are interleukins, and they are very elevated. And it just so happens that we happen to have an IL-6 antagonist and an IL-1 antagonist. Both of those are agents that were, they're proteins, and they were bioengineered for the treatment of arthritis. And so we are trying them on these patients to try and bring down that inflammatory mediator and this inflammatory response. However, the number of different cytokines that get produced by your body and cause this cytokine storm are multiple. There's tens of, maybe even hundreds of these. And these anti-inflammatories that we're using, the IL-6 and the IL-1, are just targeting one of the inflammatory marker. And so it comes to, you would think that if you could decrease a broad spectrum of all of these inflammatory markers, that would be suitable. Yeah. And so initially we were treating with high dose steroids intravenously, except when you give a high dose steroid, you're also complicating a lot of your metabolic, normal metabolic processes that go on in your body. And not only were we not seeing them to be effective, but we felt that they were also causing too much damage with such a high dose. So we're kind of left with, we have this inflammatory response, but we don't yet have a good treatment to try and quell it in the beginning.
Got it. So obviously this kind of brings us full circle to what treatments are being developed, what kinds of approaches to anti-inflammatories are going to work or seem optimistic. I know this is part of the work, Jackie, that you're doing at CenJam. So maybe you can explain some of that more specifically, what you're working on.
Sure. As I had mentioned in the beginning, our platform of agents at CenJam Pharmaceuticals are really for pain management. However, we're treating pain by decreasing inflammation. And so when COVID-19 occurred, we really wanted to take a deep dive into our product and see how we could provide a broad spectrum anti-inflammatory agent to patients with COVID-19. So what I was able to do, because CenJam doesn't create products from scratch, what we do is we repurpose old drugs for new uses. And because we need a solution for COVID-19 now, trying to come up with a new drug seems 10 years away, maybe 15. So the only way we can come up with a treatment for COVID-19 to help all these patients is if we repurpose drugs that already exist. And so we have a combination product that has a very potent, it's a combination of two drugs that are both known to decrease inflammation. And by combining them together, we feel that we have one of the strongest orally available anti-inflammatory agent possible. And so we started testing our drug in not only the virus in cell cultures, but also we are planning to do an animal study, or at least in tissues, that can show this inflammatory response. And when we introduce our drug, we're hoping that we can show that we can decrease that inflammatory response. We have partnered with the Ministry of Health in France, who is also on the same track with introducing anti-inflammatory therapy, but broad spectrum anti-inflammatory therapy. And we're hoping to work with them to start either phase 2 or phase 3 studies in humans during the summertime. And so we have to collect a little bit of data for our in vitro, they're called in vitro studies out of the human. And then hopefully, if all goes right, we can introduce our product into humans in the summertime.
In the summertime. It sounds like a pretty rapid development process.
Yes. Well, it can only be rapid because these drugs are available generically, and we already have 20 years of data to prove that they're safe in humans. So that's the whole idea of why repurposing drugs is an amazing way to get inexpensive drugs to a huge amount of population of people as soon as possible.
Dr. Japour, I'll give it to you next in terms of talking about what is being developed in this particular anti-inflammatory space.
There are, as Jackie said, most of the drugs that are being used, or at least being tested, are those that are already on the market for other reasons. And they're just, some are intravenous, some are oral. Many of us in clinical practice have used a Medrol dose pack, which is the lower dose of the steroid combination with really most of our viral infections we would treat with both an antiviral as well as a low-dose steroid. But with this disease, it's requiring a heavier duty anti-inflammatory than a low-dose steroid, it seems.
Interesting, interesting. We are entering into the Q&A portion of this webinar, and I'm going to kick it off with one of my own questions, and I'm going to encourage anyone who's listening to put their question in the Q&A section. Both of you are entrepreneurs, and you have had to be very, very nimble and fast on your feet during this process and thinking about how to address this challenge. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about just some of the challenges of moving quickly in drug development during this type of crisis. I wonder if Jackie, maybe you could speak to that.
Sure. Well, because this is a national emergency, and I really can't even say national, this is a worldwide emergency, and it's been very interesting over the last 4 months, at least for CenGem Pharmaceutical, because typically when you are in drug development, maybe you're not sharing your data as quickly with other scientists and getting it into the public space as you as you're trying to keep your secrets. With COVID-19, it seems like the whole world has come together, and at any time throughout our process, we've been able to pick up the phone and contact researchers around the world and have discussions about what they're studying, what we're studying, and forming collaborations. So it's been this expedited path into the science. And also, the FDA has been doing a fabulous job, really, where they've been creating access to getting your product along, let's say, along your regulatory pipeline faster because of the emergency. Have you experienced the same thing with devices, Anthony?
Well, for me, what I bring to this is the experience from the HIV/AIDS epidemic back in the 1980s, where we had no diagnostic, we had no treatment. There was no way to determine who actually had the infection. And when I see the first responders on television at the hospital wearing the glove, gown, and mask and the PPE, it is so reminiscent to me of HIV and AIDS, when I worked with the virus with my own hands for 7 years, triple gloves, gown, mask, and in those days, HIV was lethal. And what we have today is a lot more than we had back in the 80s. For example, the way we diagnosed COVID-19 now through a PCR, a molecular test, didn't even exist back then. And it wasn't until the 90s when we had the first viral load tests for HIV. And today we were able to make a molecular test for COVID within weeks to months, which is amazing, because that technology from way back when is really being directly applicable. If you think of where our country was in terms of both treatments and diagnostics in January, February, and where we are today with so many companies already having products out there for diagnosis, it truly is amazing. And it really shows that our investment in science and technology in our country for one disease can have a spillover or a halo effect decades later. And it's one of the reasons why we have to continue to invest in science and technology in our country.
I think that historic perspective is so important, and appreciate you mentioning that. Let's talk really quickly about a question about costs. When people talk about hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, they often talk about the difference in cost and looking ahead at developing new anti-inflammatories. Jackie, what are the costs of some of the treatments that we did discuss, and kind of what's coming that you, obviously you can't guess, but just the cost spectrum, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the costs are pretty much all over the board. Hydroxychloroquine has been used around the world to treat malaria. and also arthritis, as I mentioned. And this is a generically available drug that is just extremely inexpensive. And then on the other side of the gamut, you have these anti-inflammatory drugs, the IL-6 antagonist and the IL-1 antagonist, that are bioengineered products. And that's using a very high technology that was created most recently. And these products are most expensive. So even the IL-6 antagonist, a therapy in the hospital with that is over $2,000. So versus, pennies for some of these other drugs that were repurposed. Remdesivir, it's going to be interesting to see how that's going to be priced, because it's not on the market yet. It was in phase 3 clinical trials with the FDA for Ebola virus. And then when COVID came, they tested it in cells in vitro out of the human, and they saw that it had antiviral capability. So how that drug is going to later on, be marketed and what the cost will be, that's for the company to determine.
Interesting.
In terms of drug development, I mean, we used to say that it costs $500 million to bring a new clinical entity or new molecular entity to the market. Today, it's over $2 billion for one drug. So it's a very expensive process to bring a drug to the market.
Are you able to speak to that increase, doubling the cost from recent years? Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's because there's so many failures in drug development, so that the costs aren't just, it's all the leads you're trying, the ones that get to phase 1 then fall out, the ones to get to phase 2. So you might have a molecule that's your lead, for example, but to get to the final product that gets approved, and all the money that's spent leading up to that single product is now about $2 billion per drug approved.
Wow.
Exactly.
Dr. Go ahead.
A way to reduce the price tag of drugs is when you repurpose drugs. In other words, we can use all of the knowledge that's been gained on a certain chemical, and if we're taking that chemical and reusing it for a different indication of use or a different disease state, you can repurpose that drug and bring it to the market for that new use. And that's a less expensive way and a less time period of getting that drug to the market. And in order to spur that innovation and that need that we have for low-cost drugs to the market as quickly as possible, the FDA allowed for repurposing to occur, and kind of like an expedited process by which you would go through in order to get a repurposed drug to market.
Dr. Japour, a question here about herd immunity, and I wonder if you could, a lot of people are thinking about this, thinking about, okay, what does the next season hold, and does herd immunity play a part in kind of moving on as a society? So I wonder if you could explain herd immunity a bit, how it affects the number of people who need to be AB positive for COVID-19.
So I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not an expert in this area, but I think back to the time when I was a child, when one of the children would develop chickenpox and the parents would all bring their kids over, expose their kids to get the chickenpox and get over with. Of course, today we have the vaccine, the varicella vaccine, so we don't do that anymore. But certainly the idea that if you could get exposed to a whiff of the virus, that would be like a vaccine dose that would allow you to have antibodies develop without getting the illness. For example, a friend of mine recently went into the hospital for an elective procedure, and as part of going in for the procedure had a nasal swab which came back negative and had an antibody test that was positive. So without knowing it, he was already immune to the COVID-19. And when this epidemic first started breaking out and they said, oh, there are 10,000 cases or 20,000 cases, I was really advocating to get 24/7 actually to get a antibody test on the market, or commercially available, because I said to me, if there are 10,000 people that are actively having this disease, there have to be 10,000, 100,000, several 100,000 people that have already been exposed. And for example, in Los Angeles, they recently been just sort of doing antibody testing in the city to just see how many people have it. And they're finding that something like 7% of the population has already been exposed. So with respect to herd immunity, you want enough people that have already been exposed and are immune so that the disease doesn't spread from person to person as easily. It is expected that approximately 70% of the entire US population will either get the disease or be exposed to the disease at some point in the future.
Now, remind me, either of you might know this, but currently, is the current knowledge that if you have a positive antibody test, is the knowledge that you cannot get it again? Do you know where we stand currently?
So there were some questions around that because in Korea, it was found that there were 2 different strains going around. And theoretically, it is possible for you to get one strain, to be immune to that strain, but then you could get another strain. And viruses tend to mutate as they circulate within various subpopulations. So it is possible that there will be multiple strains coming out. One of the tests that I mentioned that we have at AdvanceDx Biological Labs is a genotype test that looks at these various kinds of strains so that we can look at people that say are together at a party and one person got it and then several other people got it, and they can look at did that person get it from being at that party, or did they possibly get it from having been at a grocery store and not wearing a mask from a different strain. So that's the thinking behind that concept.
Interesting. Jackie, a question here. Actually, it was one from the audience from Janani Mundam, asking, what are the FDA-approved drugs for emergency use? You had mentioned remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine. Janavi is just asking, were there other ones from your experience at Northwell that have been used that you can mention?
Yeah, as well as Anthony had mentioned, those are the 2 drugs that received FDA emergency use approval. The other drugs that I had mentioned, those anti-inflammatories, are being used really either off-label or in a clinical trial, but I don't believe the FDA has granted them emergency use authorization. When the FDA does that, you're going to see them more available at different hospital locations. Some hospitals might have those drugs, some might not. But with the FDA doing the emergency use approval for hydroxychloroquine and remdesivir, you'll see those available at greater locations.
Jackie, you bring up an interesting point about kind of the consistency of treatment. In your experience at Northwell and sort of seeing the country, or even globally, how consistent is the treatment of COVID-19? How consistent is the usage of remdesivir and hydroxychloroquine and these anti-inflammatories that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, actually, I'll answer a little bit, but I would love to hear what Anthony has to say about that during HIV/AIDS epidemic, because right now, we don't have a government guideline that guides all hospitals in the United States on what the treatment should be. And so it's left to individual hospitals and hospital systems to create a task force to come up with how they feel the best treatments, the best treatment modalities should be for their patient population. So unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of small subsets of patients that get treated a certain way. Of course, what's great about science is that everyone is going to share that knowledge in publications and share their data, and then we can all learn from it. So it's good in a regard that we're not all doing the same thing, particularly if it didn't work. So we have all these small groups of patients who are going to be treated certain ways, and then we get to compare the data and decide what worked out best. And that might have been something very similar during HIV.
Well, what I was going to say with respect to COVID first is that when the data was coming out initially about hydroxychloroquine, there are lots of different dosing regimens that were being used, and also being used in combination with azithromycin. And the 2 together can have a synergistic effect, adverse effect on the heart and the heart rhythms. So I think before dismissing it or saying it's great, is one really does need to look at what was the dose of the hydroxychloroquine was used, because certainly a lower dose is safer and a higher dose is likely to be associated with greater adverse events. The other thing is are those drugs being used early in disease or late in disease? Because pretty much whatever you do, if you're giving it to a person when they're already on a ventilator, when they're already quite sick, when they're already having, say, the cytokine storm, it's harder to tease out the beneficial effects of these antiviral drugs. So with remdesivir, it was done in a more controlled fashion because Gilead had total control. They knew the dosing from Ebola, and that could be tested in a stricter fashion. In the days of HIV, absolutely. When we started with AZT, we were using 4 times the amount of drug that was really necessary, which was causing a tremendous amount of adverse events. And later on, we ended up using only a quarter of the dose of AZT, for example, when it was used way back when. And then maybe the similar thing that we're seeing today, that maybe because the in vitro data on hydroxychloroquine as both an antiviral and as an anti-inflammatory does look quite compelling, but we have to look at dosing, and maybe a lower dose used earlier in disease, either as a prevention, it is used, hydroxychloroquine is used as a prevention for malaria, and it's quite safe. So maybe using hydroxychloroquine earlier in disease at lower doses may be better than using higher doses and in more advanced stages. They do see viral load levels where they've measured it in both hydroxychloroquine as well as remdesivir. The viral load levels definitely do come down with both products. So FDA very rarely, I think only maybe 10 times in its history, has ever approved emergency use authorization. So there had to be data there. And I've looked at the data. It's quite compelling that these drugs do have activity, but it might be enough. We need to combine it really with that anti-inflammatory component, because those drugs don't treat the entire syndrome.
Sure. That's close to the time that we have. I want to finish with a lightning round question for each of you. This has been a dark and challenging time for many, many people these last few months. And I want to ask you, what gives you optimism coming into the summer? What are you excited to see happen in the coming months? Something good coming out of this global collaboration and this movement within the industry. What makes you optimistic about the summertime? Jackie, you first.
Sure. So I'm really excited, that there has been such an emphasis on repurposing drugs, whether it's our drug or another company's drug. But I've always believed that getting drugs inexpensively and to large populations is what a pharmaceutical should be able to do. And so I'm thrilled that an emphasis has been placed on repurposing, because I believe that there's so many drugs out there that can do other things than what they were originally intended to do. And we really need to really utilize that as a way of expanding our pharmaceutical options.
Thanks, Jackie. Dr. Japour?
What excites me is just seeing the civic engagement, to see everybody coming together and working on this collectively. I know our team, we're all working 24/7, and we feel committed to eradicating this disease and getting our economy back, getting people back working again, and that kind of purposefulness of our life, giving meaning to all our lives is what is exciting for me to see. People sort of meeting the challenge.
That's great. Well, that's the time that we have today. Jackie Iversen, Dr. Anthony Japour, I thank you for taking the time to really explain about these treatments, but even more so, the work that both of you are doing to bring things to market that can really help so many people. So I thank you.
Thank you, Logan.
Thank you.
I want to say that today's event was presented by Syngene Pharmaceuticals, AdvanceDx Biological Laboratories, Red Crow, and Startup Health. If you want to learn more about AdvanceDx, you can contact Monica Greenwell, EVP of Corporate Communication. I'm going to put all of the contact information in the chat, because no one's going to write down the email addresses as I say them quickly. But if you want to learn more about CenJam, you can reach out to Christine Leonard, Head of Marketing Communication. If you want to reach Red Crow Investor Relations, you reach out to Lorraine Migliori at Red Crow. And finally, CenJam Pharmaceutical is currently equity crowdfunding on Red Crow's platform. So I'm going to throw the contact information in the chat right there. All the email addresses are there. Scan through those if there's someone that you want to reach out to. Also, you can find any of us on LinkedIn. But thank you so much for joining this webinar, and thank you for taking the time. So again, thanks to Jackie Iversen and Dr. Anthony Japour.
Thank you.
Thank you, Logan.
Have a great day, everyone. Be well, be healthy.